My name is Sean Burkholder. I'm an assistant professor of landscape and urban design here at UB. I mean, the work that I do primarily in relationship to the city is I work a lot with the vacant land mitigation projects as they relate to stormwater infrastructure and green infrastructure. But we're not actually going to talk much about green infrastructure at all. The goal of this talk actually today is for us to really understand where we are today. We have to have some idea of where we've come from. When we're thinking about urban design and neighborhood planning, there's been a whole host of really good and really horrible ideas that have happened in the past. And so sometimes it's just nice to familiarize ourselves with what ideas have come about before. It also helps arm us with good and bad examples that we can use when we have to deal with things within the city presently. So what we're going to do today is look through a whole series of just projects that have happened, primarily in the Western world, primarily since the kind of early 1900s, and look at basically the relationship between physical form, open space or green space, or landscape, which is what I focus mostly on, and the relationships between vehicular and pedestrian traffic. And we'll do that as a long series of case studies, and I'm going to talk fast and go over some things quickly. I think these things are published online, so if there's a project that I kind of gloss over, we can go back, or you can go back and do some more research on it if you would like to. So, 100 years here in 20 minutes. It's going to be great. It's going to be good fun. And I talk fast, so it'll be all right. Okay, so if we start in 1900, our first example, and we'll kind of talk about this very quickly, would be Olmsted, Frederick Law Olmsted. This is in the city of Chicago. This is a commuter suburb in the city of Chicago. People took the train line. You can see the horizontal line here. I don't know if I have a laser pointer here, so I do have that. Well, here. There's a big line. That line is the rail line that goes into the city of Chicago. When Olmsted laid out this plan, people weren't driving cars yet. These were carriage roads. People rode their carriages. But all of the roads were nice and curvilinear to help afford views around curves. We have our own version of Riverside here in the city of Buffalo, built pretty shortly after, which is the Parkside neighborhood. So you have developers that are building suburban communities but are connected to the city via transit. Certainly something we'll come back to. So the other thing that we'll be looking at is why build a community in the first place, particularly kind of one from nothing. And so one of the ideas is that the creation of actually a capital city in a country. This is in this country of Australia. The capital city in Australia is Canberra. It was actually laid out and designed by a landscape architect, Walter Burley Griffin. And I think the important things to call attention to this project are the fact that A, it was done by a landscape architect, and B, it is highly integrated with the water systems in an incredibly dry climate. So you have this series of basins and ponds that stretch through the center of the city, and then, of course, we have a series of axial arranged kind of features through the city that most capital cities everywhere in the world kind of have. We're going to gloss over. Olmsted was also doing a series of parks, around the world at this point in time. So we know we have projects in Boston, the Back Bay Fens, and the Emerald Necklace. So how green projects, in this case a series of parks, actually provide green infrastructure for the city. So the neighborhood's actually begun being planned around a kind of series of green parks. And all the parks were a little different. So all the neighborhoods had different things near them. It also connected a whole series of neighborhoods. And even then, Olmsted was having problems in getting feedback from neighborhoods who, we immediately think that connectivity is exactly the right answer, but sometimes communities don't want to have connections to other communities, which is a huge kind of social issue that we have to address, but Olmsted was even dealing with it back then. The Back Bay Fens used to be a giant cesspool. These guys are literally dredging poop out of a pond and dumping it into the Charles River in order to make the Back Bay Fens. But this is a story for probably a different lecture. But the Back Bay Fens now looks like this and goes out to the Charles River. But it's certainly an example of how a large park system can actually help the waterworks of a city function better and deal with in this case, the sewage treatment system within the city of Boston. So, probably one of the first examples of actually building towns came from company towns in the really beginning of the 1900s and late 1800s, where a company would actually have a bunch of employees, and it was actually better for them to keep the employees close so they weren't coming in from unreliable means of transportation, and also that they realized that if they provided really good housing for their employees were happier and stayed longer. So in Illinois, the Pullman Company made rail cars. They developed, this is actually still a suburb of Chicago if you've been there, a rail company that made rail cars connected to the city by rail line, but all of the residents all the employees from Pullman actually lived in this community in Chicago. And so here you can see the typology, these really long row houses, a series of relatively great opulent gardens that were done there, and a good number of these are still within the city today. Across the pond in England, similarly, the Lever brothers who make soap, Lever soap, were doing a similar project there called Port Sunlight. Sunlight was the soap brand that they were making at the time. And you can see here, instead of the long linear bars, you have a series of kind of clusters of housing around allotment gardens, so people had access to their own public gardens where they could grow food, a larger park system that kind of connected things, and then the factories are off on the right-hand side here. Unlike Pullman, a whole series of architects were hired to do these projects, so every building was a little different. So there was a nice architectural range in Port Sunlight, and it's still there today as well. Probably the most influential movement within urban design that has kind of impacted kind of the history, at least of Western urban planning, is probably the Garden Cities movement, which was started in England, mostly from a book written by a fellow named Ebenezer Howard, who wrote a book called Garden Cities of Tomorrow. Ebenezer Howard was really interested in this relationship between the country and the city. The idea that the city had a lot of great things in it, and it was good, but in the 1900s, you can imagine what the cities were like as well. They were pretty dirty and had a lot of problems. And there were also advantages to the country, but also a significant amount of disadvantages. And so what Ebenezer Howard started to advocate for was this, what he called the town-country magnet, which is this bottom magnet. The idea that what you want to do is create a place where all of the advantages of both the city and the country would be present, and all the disadvantages would not be present, which, of course, is something that we still kind of try to attribute to our designs today. He did a whole bunch of diagrams from his book, trying to indicate, the perfect size of this community, their relationship to green space. That was the idea of the Garden City, is it would have this whole series. This is the Garden City example up in the upper left. The circle in the middle is the city center, and then there would be this whole range of pasture fields and accessible landscapes that would be available on the outside. So a relationship between kind of the city and the country all together at once. And so there were two garden cities, at least initially, that were constructed. One was Welwyn, the other was Letchworth. Letchworth is on the right. This on the left is Welwyn in an advertisement that they put in the newspaper to convince people that this was the right way to plan a town. Yesterday you lived and worked in this smoky, horrible place. Today you just live in the suburbs and you drive into the center city, so you're still exposed to this horrible condition. And tomorrow you're going to live in Welwyn Garden City, and it's going to be gorgeous, and everything's great. You'll have this great mix of both, like a place to work and a place to live. Probably, again, you can begin to see how suburbanization began to kind of take hold even this early on. If you look on the diagram of Letchworth on the right, you can see some things that we still will value and talk about for the rest of this talk. There's a rail line that cuts through the middle of the city that connects to the larger cities, just like in Ebenezer Howard's plan. There's a city center right in the center. There's a green belt, this kind of dark area around the side. You have a bunch of green space that kind of limits the growth of the town. And again, a transit line that everyone can walk to. Excuse me. And that's some diagrams of what it looks like today, and I will, again, just have to kind of keep moving. So here in the States, we were also trying to figure out how we were going to digest this issue of the neighborhood and the garden city here in America. And so Clarence Perry, who was working for the City of New York Planning Department, started working out a planning system that talked to what he called the neighborhood unit. The neighborhood unit is really just a kind of a walking circle that says that people really only want to walk about 5 or 10 minutes to get to certain things, and realize that if that's the case, then put everything they need in that circle. And right in the center of it is where the community center goes. In this case, there are churches. In future cases, we're talking about grocery stores and post offices. The things that people need, they should be able to walk to. And so this radius is a quarter mile for the smaller community things, and then as you get larger to the half mile, you're talking about a 10-minute walk, and that's generally the radius used for transit. So if no one wants to walk more than 10 minutes to get to the bus or the train to get into the city. And you'll see this has really been one of the key movements in urban design planning from this point forward. We still want to walk more. We should all walk more. In 1929 in Radburn, one of the first neighborhoods planned that was trying to integrate both the vehicle, the automobile now, people are starting to buy cars by this point in time, and people are wanting to keep them near their houses. And so how to negotiate the relationship with these two. Radburn still to this day has probably worked out one of the most interesting and successful strategies for this. If you look on the diagram on the right is the best way. The kind of unit block for Radburn is what you see here. There's a motorway that runs down the middle of this community. All the kind of cars park in it. And then you have footways that run on the other side. And so all the houses face the footways, and the footways are the green front yards, and everyone just basically parks in the back of their house. It was advertised as a place where kids could ride their bikes around safely and not get run over by Model A's and such. So it was a great place for you to have kids and also have a car. Images from Radburn, you can see that even when those two paths crossed, they were grade separated. So you would actually walk underneath the roads that would go over top. And then the kind of footpaths on the bottom here, this gives you an idea of what the footpaths and the front doors of all this look like. Nice, tight community, green trees, walking paths, no cars anywhere to be seen. So Stein and Wright also did another project in Queens called Sunnyside Gardens, and we're going to gloss over it really quickly, but the only important thing to know here is Lewis Mumford, the kind of famous kind of civic theorist and urban designer, lived here for the majority of his life. Also had a lot of community gardens planned for it. So then we just fast forward. I like how I talk about this, and we just pass 30 years, goes by. There's and we have the Dust Bowl and the Depression, and things are bad. And so the federal government, we have the idea that, kind of the utopian ideas of what neighborhood planning should be. And then we have the issue that people are kind of starving to death in the United States of America. The Dust Bowl has caused tremendous problems. Farming's not working, and things are quite bad. And so the city kind of forms, or FDR forms the Resettlement Act, which is actually starting to pull people to resettle certain parts of the United States. And so there were these 3 cities in and around the United States that were developed during this act. So those 3 cities were Greenbelt, Maryland, I'm going to say Green Hills, Ohio, which is here, and Green Glen, Wisconsin, I think, near Milwaukee. So these 3 cities were near bigger cities. So Green Hills was near Cincinnati, and Greenbelt was near Baltimore. And so these towns were taking Perry's idea of putting things close together. Everyone could walk places. They were connected to transit. They had green belts around them so people could actually use the land, and they were constructed by the people that lived there in most cases. So these communities these are really early photos from the federal government. The houses were really pushed close to the street. They were on the street, and that opened up their backyards for these long shared, sometimes gardens, sometimes big play areas that you have here. And of course, you can tell these are pretty early photos based on the size of those poor little trees. So Greenbelt, Maryland, one of the others. All 3 of these cities were built close to big cities, and at this point in time have basically completely consumed by the suburban development that those cities have created. Most of them also have established historic districts, though, so you can go back and you can still find pieces of them. Now a tangent, as if I'm ready for another tangent. At the same time, the government is trying to save people. Frank Lloyd Wright is locked in some crazy office in Chicago, dreaming up the utopian future of the United States of America. And that was coming in this idea of Broadacre City, which was a highly independent, the idea that everyone was going to work for themselves, this huge gridded plan that stretched out across the United States where everyone had their own piece of property, but also everyone was connected by automobiles. So back in the 30s, Wright was already assuming that automobiles were going to be the primary organizer of the country. In this case, these are the futuristic drawings that Wright was doing. There are weird spaceships here in the 30s already, which is nuts. But you also notice this huge grid of cars on this property, which, of course, is certainly indicative of what has actually happened. We don't quite have spaceships like that yet. Yeah, they're drones. That's right. It's actually scary. You're right. They are drones. Oh, my goodness. It's already happening. I've been trying to make sure Broadacre City doesn't happen. Okay, so next big problem is the war. Yes. So the war happens. The Levitt brothers are a company or 2 brothers that own a development company, and what they've been doing is building kind of prefab homes for wealthy people during the war. And they realize that there's going to be this giant market from all the people that are coming home from the war. So they learn how to mass produce houses, sell them for under $10,000 a piece, and built 2 towns, one in New York and one in Pennsylvania. 47 was in Pennsylvania, and New York was built in 51. So these 2 towns basically laid houses out on grids. You can see everything showed up at once, put up the house. Bam. They did it in a day. They all look the same. You can see the foundations in the back being poured. So foundations get poured, the box of parts shows up, and your house goes together. The thing about these houses is that they all look the same. So the only place for individuality in the houses were how people decorated them. So there's been a lot of interesting studies of people saying, like, what do you do with your basement? Because all of your basements are exactly the same. So people decorate them, and they had these like goofy contests to see whose basement was the nicest. It's really unfortunate that even here, and like we're talking about the 50s, the Levitt brothers were not permitting African Americans to actually apply for loans to get this property. So, and it was not until the late 50s when the actual Supreme Court required them to open up this to minorities that they were actually allowed to apply for residency here. So, I mean, like Levittown is great, but it was a tremendous failure on a whole bunch of levels. It was highly also criticized for, like a lot of our suburbs today, for being highly separated. No one had any connections, no sense of community, and being highly auto-dependent. And so we reacted to that too. And so we're going to talk about one of about 3 towns that we built in the 60s and 70s where a large developer decided to go back to some of the ideas of the neighborhood unit, figure out what happens when we put a whole bunch of people together in one particular area, a high level of economic diversity, and figure out how it gets reconnected back to the landscape. So there are a couple of towns. I'm going to talk about Reston, Virginia really quickly. Columbia, Maryland is another example of these. Reston, Virginia was a town built by this the guy, Simon, who's the Simon of all the Simon shopping malls, if you know this developer. He actually lives here and was the first person to kind of conceive of this town. This town has a whole series of little districts in it. So this is I don't have a laser pointer, but there's a Ann Lake district up in the north, and the South Lake district is in the south, and then there's Hunting Woods is another district. And so there were these themed communities that had a central core of amenities that everyone could walk to, and the idea that you could use the environment to also help create a sense of community. So people would connect themselves with the fact that I'm near the lake or I'm in the woods kind of in the neighborhood. So it's not that all neighborhoods were exactly the same, but they all used the landscape themselves to help create some level of identity. Another town, this is the Ann Lake district here, an early drawing of it. Okay, so, and then we get to plan planning now, which is where we are. And so what we find ourselves looking to is back to kind of looking back to traditional forms, but also looking back again to the neighborhood unit. These are some drawings done by the Congress of New Urbanism, looking at the relationship between like what kind of centralized town planning, or what might be called, kind of new urbanism planning, which is focused on the neighborhood unit here. And you think about the street grid and the high level of connectivity that the street grid provides. You can get on a road and you can walk somewhere quickly, as opposed to the kind of frightening cul-de-sac environment that you have here, where if you live here and you need to get here and you have to go, oh goodness. So it's a problem. So there's the idea that there are some kind of standards that actually, if you're just thinking about people walking from one place to the other, there's some really basic rules that you can follow that are good. And the fact that we completely ignore them when we start thinking about the car. Another diagram from the CNU looking at kind of the density of development that you can get around centralized neighborhoods and the amount of farmland, in this case, that you might actually be able to get. The hypothesis here is the population is the same here as it is here. I know I'm preaching to the choir and we all get this, but there's no farmland in this scheme, just a lot of private land. And it also requires that level, as is mentioned, that level of density is required for things like public transit, which we all know are good. Public transit also develops, we can think about idealized diagrams such as this one, where we look at the center being this like kind of rapid transit hub, bus line, whatever, train line, and then a series of smaller communities around it that everyone, of course, this is a diagram and no place actually looks like this. Actually, there probably are places that look like this. And then the kind of manifestations of the CNU kind of range. So the things that the New Urbanism has produced are, I think, maybe kind of, in my candid opinion, maybe bad examples of places where you have high levels of control from everything to kind of the density, which is, I think, an important piece of it, to also kind of telling everyone what shape and color your house should be and what roof pitches you should have, and this sort of thing. So like a highly form-based code, which does have its places, as was mentioned, even the Buffalo Green Code here is to some degree a form-based code, and I think a pretty effective one. This is also kind of just a mecca for old white people in Florida. So it has it's I mean, it is, but I think that the issues of new urbanism are the kind of core foundation here is still the fact that people are in a neighborhood, they know each other, and they can walk to places. And these are all things that we need to be able to do. And I think so foundationally there are examples that are actually touted as being okay, but I think that there are other examples, the Kentlands in Maryland, other places where we're not necessarily falling as far back on nostalgia and really just trying to figure out how people can walk to places and be connected to public transit, which I think are essential. This was also happening in England. So CNU has some people in England. This is Leon Creer's project for Poundbury, which is a really dense little hamlet that was designed this way to help preserve a whole bunch of green space around it. It's formally quite different than some of the examples that we have here in America. The streets are all really tiny and tight, and the buildings are kind of jogged around to help this place look a little denser than it is in terms of its, if you made it straight lines, it would be like 4 blocks big, and it would be really tiny. So he shuffles everything around and makes it feel really dense. And you can see some photos of this here, but of a really interesting place. And you can see the landscape that's been preserved by kind of applying for this level of density. Peter Calthorpe also, again, talking about transit-oriented development and new urbanism, also one of the founders of the CNU, looking at, again, we've seen this before, 2,000 feet, that's a little over a quarter mile. You're getting a walking circle that says if you take public transit, you need to be able to walk to it, so you don't have to have a car. Being near a bus stop is pointless if you have an automobile or you need to have an automobile. So people here can walk to the bus stop. And on your way, you pass the core commercial area of the city, so you pick up your groceries, you do everything you need to do. And all of our cities, here within this region, have the capacity to do this. We just need to figure out how to move forward on them. Forward. That's right. What does it mean by forward? We will get into that, I guess, later again. There are also examples of kind of more utopian communities that have been developed around the country. This is a kind of an ecotopia that's been designed in Ithaca, New York. I think the important parts of this are that people are really learning that sharing things brings them together. So the idea that they share resources, they have shared kind of dining spaces here, they have shared wood shops. So, I think for things, the ways that brings communities together, if you're going to work on your house, you don't all need table saws. We go down the street and every one of you have a table saw in your garage. But really, and you're never using it. I think the idea that if you have 3 table saws in a neighborhood, that's all you need. And then you get to share stuff with your neighbors and hang out with one another. And that's important. Things in Holland, is a good example of looking at how people live together really densely, but we're not going to do that because I'm talking fast and running out of time. Other communities in England, these are starting to become hyper-green places. So I think the one thing that is different from where we were in the past is that we really need to find out how to be environmentally friendly with the neighborhoods that we're laying out. And so this is an example of one that has kind of every type of bell and whistle technology built into it, lots of water recycling. You can see stack cooling, these big stacks that come out of the top that help cool the house. Everyone has their own garden. So it's a little bit of a Frankenstein monster of a building, but it was really designed just to showcase the level of technology that's available in terms of sustainable living. And then something that I'm interested in as well is how does the landscape itself inform how we lay out a neighborhood? We've seen how the kind of traditional street grids have done it, and the idea of the kind of historic traditional kind of architectural typologies, but also looking at the larger landscape and saying, what does the larger landscape say about how we should be building things? So some of this goes back to Ian McHarg's work in the 70s and 80s. This is a plan for Staten Island, but just doing overlays and saying there are places that we should be developing and places that we shouldn't, and we can actually figure that out. So this is before GIS was possible. This was all happening. And then looking at basically the field conditions and saying, again, what does the landscape tell us about how to design things, to design a neighborhood? And that actually the landscape itself has the ability to inform the form of things as well. That doesn't mean we should forget about walkability and transit, and the idea that we all should be spending more time with one another and on our feet and not in our cars, because it should happen. And I'm going to kind of go through these because these are big, large-scale planning projects for both parks and neighborhoods that are starting to look at, again, how things like water systems, for example, are highly integrated into the city fabric. So how do we use things like water? How do we use things like habitat? As ways of pulling our neighborhood together. This project here is for development project, a proposal for a development project in Canada, which was looking at how does habitat that moves through the landscape actually start generating the form of the landscape itself. The neighborhood actually starts taking form from the way that we actually want the ecology to function within that neighborhood. as opposed to, saying that the ecology happens somewhere else. Because we realize that, I think it's been pointed out, everything is always changing. Animals are moving around, we're moving around, water's moving around. We should design landscapes that incorporate it. And so instead of looking back at architectural research, what you find is these places are starting to look at ecology research. So how do plants and animals actually operate? How do they develop through processes of succession and evolve over time? And how can our landscapes and natural environments actually respond to those, as opposed to actually, in most cases, being highly inhibitive to the kind of operations that are underway here? And I think so we say that the planning diagrams of these types of projects are starting to look more like this. And they are indicative of change over time. That's what's happening. We're starting to plan communities that evolve. We're not being this, we have no disbelief that things are changing. We know that everything is evolving over time, and we need to, plan with it or figure out how to address it in some way or the other, but we can't be ignorant to the idea that the landscapes that we're working in are changing. And that's all I have. Whew.